Hey y'all, it's me, and you already know. Like, share, and subscribe. What's up, real deal? Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in your country. You are a real deal. All right, real deal. What we about to do is continue with the day 6 Henry Dinkins trial. Missing and kidnapping the Asian. Terrell had a sleepover. They had a sleepover over to her father's house, over to her brother's father's house. Okay, her half brother house. Okay. Thank you, DJ. Cut the music, please. Thank you. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead on and continue with the trial. Okay, where we left out. Okay.
The state would call Monique Brillhart.
Monique. I couldn't get the last name. She gonna spell it. Monique is okay. So Monique, Grill something. She said. Shout out to WQD8 News.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please have a seat. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you please state and spell your name for the record?
My name is Monique Brillhart. My first name is spelled Monique. My last name is spelled Brillhart.
And how are you currently employed?
I am employed by the FBI Laboratory Latent Print Operations Unit.
How long have you worked for the FBI Laboratory?
I have worked for the FBI Laboratory for 19 years.
And have you always worked in the latent print department?
Yes.
What are your duties in the latent print department for the FBI?
So as a latent print examiner, I receive items of evidence for the detection and development of latent prints. Any latent prints that I am able to detect or develop, I will then compare to the known prints of individuals that are either submitted by a contributing agency or obtained through the FBI's fingerprint database.
Can you describe your educational background and the training that you've received in order to hold your position?
I received a Bachelor of Science degree in biology with a concentration in criminalistics from York College of Pennsylvania, which is located in York, Pennsylvania. I also received a Master's of Science degree in biotechnology with a concentration in weapons of mass destruction from the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland.
And from there, once you began your employment with the FBI, did you engage in any further training specific to latent fingerprints?
Yes, I did.
Could you describe that for us?
So my training at the FBI Laboratory consisted of approximately a 2-year training program. And that training program consisted of classroom lectures, examinations, both written tests, comparison examinations, comparison exercises, oral boards, presentations, and moot courts. And at the completion of my training, I successfully passed a full comprehensive qualification examination.
Do you have to engage in any sort of continuing education or ongoing training in order to hold your position as well?
Yes.
And what does that entail?
So each year we are required to participate in a certain number of hours of continuing education in our discipline. And additionally, in addition to that, I also am required to successfully pass a proficiency examination every year.
And have you passed every year?
Yes.
Ms. Brillhart, what are latent fingerprints?
So on the palmar surfaces of your hand, as well as the soles of your feet, there are raised portions of skin known as friction ridges. And those friction ridges exude sweat. So when you touch an item, you may leave an impression of that friction ridge arrangement on the item. Many times, latent prints are not visible to the naked eye. So they require different light sources, chemicals, or fingerprint powders to be able to visualize them.
So when you are provided an item in your lab with the goal of trying to see if there's any sort of latent fingerprints or friction ridges on that item, how do you begin examining it?
So the first thing that I consider is what kind of item is it? For example, is it a porous item such as paper? So paper is a porous item in which the sweat that may be present on the friction ridges would soak into the item. Or is it a non-porous item, such as something that is smooth, like plastic or glass, in which the friction ridges would be essentially on top of the item? That will then be the driving force of determining what different chemical methods that I will use to then develop latent prints.
And how does the process differ based on whether it's a porous item versus a non-porous item?
So for example, if I have a piece of paper, I will start with just a general visual examination, followed up by various light sources, such as a laser light, looking for any latent prints that may inherently fluoresce. Some latent prints are able to do that based on the composition of the sweat. Following that, I will use a chemical known as indane which is used on paper, and then following that up with a process known as physical developer. Now, how that differs from non-porous items, in that with a non-porous item, I still do a visual examination with oblique lighting, looking for any latent prints that might be detected. Then a light source, such as a laser light. The difference here now is I will use super glue fuming, in which I will place the item into a super glue fuming chamber. I will use liquid super glue, burn the super glue to create essentially a smoke that adheres to any moisture on the item, such as latent print residue. And at the completion of super glue fuming, I apply a dye stain, which allows me to visualize any latent prints that are coated with that dye stain under the laser light.
Based on your training and experience, are there certain items that you're more likely to find latent fingerprints on versus other items?
It just depends. It's no there's no real number to that or anything, but in general terms, paper, because when you touch a piece of paper and the residue is able to soak directly into the paper, and you cannot rub the latent print off because it's inside the paper itself, as opposed to something that is non-porous, in which when you touch the item, the friction ridges are on top of the item. They are more easily damaged in general terms, just because of the nature of those types of items.
So I understand a porous item seems to absorb the fingerprint. It would potentially maintain it maybe a little better than a non-porous item where the friction ridges just kind of sit on top.
Correct.
Which would make it easier to be damaged or wiped away or something along those lines.
Yes.
Now, once you have an item and you've gone through your process of trying to see if there are any fingerprints, latent fingerprints on that item, if you do make some sort of identification, does that necessarily mean that that print or whatever it is that you have found would be usable for later identifications?
So as I'm processing items of evidence, if I do detect friction ridge development, I will then photograph that particular latent print to then determine if there is enough quality and quantity of information within that latent print to then drive it to the next step, which would move into a comparison stage to a particular individual.
What type of quality or quantity is required in order to then compare to a known latent fingerprint?
So every latent print is different. Essentially, as I am conducting my examination of any latent prints that are detected, I start with an analysis step where essentially I am looking at the overall ridge flow of that latent print, determining if it's clear enough, if there are enough features within that latent print where I would feel as though I would be able to essentially make an identification decision at the end of my examination. So it's very case dependent, latent print to latent print, but essentially it is looking at all the information contained in that latent print to determine whether or not I would be able to compare to an individual and ultimately reach an identification decision.
Is there a difference between locating some friction ridge detail and determining that it's just not suitable for comparison versus not finding anything at all?
Yes, that does occur. There are times in which I will examine items of evidence and I will see no friction ridge development whatsoever. And there are times in which I will see some friction ridge development. It may or may not be able to be used, to the other spectrum of, yes, there is enough information that it can drive to the comparison step and ultimately would be able to be identified to a particular individual.
In situations where you are presented with an object where there's information that you know somebody had contact with this object, would you expect to find friction ridge detail every single time?
No, I would not.
Why not?
There are many factors involved in touching an item and not leaving a latent print behind. For example, the weather outside. If it's very cold outside, your friction ridges tend not to want to produce sweat and produce that sweat on the friction ridges of the finger. So when you touch an item, you may not leave that impression. Whereas if it's really hot outside, alternatively, you may be sweating a lot, you may touch the item, but it may smear a lot if it's like on a non-porous item. There are conditions outside weather, if it rained on a particular item of evidence, if someone were wearing gloves. I talked about non-porous items in which the latent prints are actually on top of the item. It's very easy to damage those by wiping them away because the friction ridges are setting on top. There can also be factors involved with just the skin condition of an individual. When we are younger, our friction ridges tend to be more plump. It allows the friction ridges to come in contact a little more easy with an item, as opposed to as we age, our friction ridges tend to flatten out as it's the normal aging process, which can prevent some of that contact as well. Also an occupation of an individual. If someone is using their hands a lot, maybe a bricklayer, for example, they may wear down those ridges, which could make that a little more difficult to leave a latent print. So there are various environmental factors that can occur with leaving latent prints.
Now, you did mention if somebody has wiped down an item, that could potentially affect your ability to find any latent prints. Would, along those same lines, cleaning or using bleach or some sort of cleaner like that also affect your ability to find latent prints?
Yes, especially with the non-porous items, being that the latent print is on top of the item, that would have an effect.
When you are examining items, do you have the ability yourself to do any sort of testing to see if an item has been cleaned prior to that item being presented to you?
No.
Do you have the ability to test any specific items to see if bleach has been used on that item?
No, I do not.
Once you have completed your examination on a specific item and you do find that there are usable latent fingerprints, how would you then compare that item to a known latent fingerprint?
So after I determine, based on my full analysis of a latent print, that there is enough information contained within that latent print to move to the comparison step, I will then determine if I was asked to compare an actual individual to any latent prints in that submission. And if I am, then I will retrieve that known card, if I am able, from our fingerprint database. It's a repository of fingerprints. If I am not presented with an individual to compare, I would then search that into our fingerprint database.
And so once you are able to determine, or if you are provided with that known fingerprint, what's your process for comparing the known with what you found on an item?
So following that analysis step in which I determined that I'm able to do that, it's like a fork in a road, or an ending ridge, which is a ridge that continues and then stops, or a dot, which is a ridge that is as wide as it is thick. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for those characteristics that I observed during my analysis in the latent print, and looking for the same characteristic of the same type, the same location, and the same spatial location and direction within the known print to determine whether or not those two prints are sharing the same features. So essentially, if you think of a constellation in the sky like the Big Dipper, I'm looking for those features in that same spatial arrangement. As I continue on with my comparison, at the end of my comparison, I then make a determination whether or not this is an identification, meaning that I am finding strong support for these features in agreement, or an exclusion decision where I'm finding strong support for the features not in agreement, or an inconclusive in which I am unable to determine based on the information that I am presented.
And I apologize if you've already said this, but does every individual have their own unique set of fingerprints or for their hands or feet?
Yes, they do.
So similarly to DNA, if you do find an inclusive fingerprint, are you able to then say that fingerprint is most likely belonging to this person on this item?
If I am able to find enough information in agreement, it will drive strong support for an identification, meaning that that would be that individual's fingerprint, yes.
Now, regarding this particular case, were you provided certain items to examine?
Yes.
And were you provided those items sometime in between July and August 14th of 2020?
Yes.
And is it common practice for you to author a report of your findings?
Yes, it is.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm showing you what's been marked here as State's Exhibit 48. Do you recognize this exhibit?
Yes, I do.
And what is State's Exhibit 48?
This is my official latent print report.
And is this a fair and accurate copy of the report you authored regarding your findings of the items provided to you for this particular incident?
Yes.
At this time, Your Honor, the state would offer Exhibit 48 into evidence.
No objection.
Exhibit 48 is admitted.
May I publish, Your Honor?
You may.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Showing you then page 1 of States Exhibit 48. I do think there's a way to zoom here. Okay, so just starting here at the top, there appears to be a lab number at the top of this report. Is that the lab number that the FBI lab would have assigned to this case?
Yes.
There is also a date here listed of July 22nd, 2020. What is that date in reference to?
The communication date refers to the laboratory the laboratory examination request from the field office.
And then, see, shifting over, I have to zoom out. At the top of the report here, there's a date of August 14th, 2020. What is that date in reference to?
That date is in reference to the date I authored the report.
So listed out here under the FBI laboratory evidence designators, what are all those items that we see listed?
All of the items listed are what I received for latent print examinations.
Now, all of those items have been assigned an item number. Where does that number come from?
That number is assigned at the FBI laboratory. As items of evidence come in for a submission, we will then assign the number sequentially in that particular case.
So just for example, looking first at item number 19, there appears to then be a description of that item. Where did that description come from?
That description is actually determined by our evidence management unit as they inventory items of evidence that come into the laboratory. That would come from the field office or whoever our contributor was. Those particular descriptions, though, are determined by our evidence management unit.
And as you've indicated, usually from the field office, who would have provided that item to you?
Yes.
So then next to the description in the parentheses, there appears to be several series of numbers. What is that?
So a 1B number and then the E number, which is a barcode, those are very specific numbers for field offices in regards to their evidence that they are submitting.
So my understanding then is, so just looking at the top item there, item 19, that would be the lab number for the hatchet from the trunk of the 2007 Chevy Impala. But the number right next to that, the 1B2, that would be the field office identification number for that item.
That is correct. They use that as a tracking mechanism.
Okay. So then looking at all of these items, can you just go through each of the items that you would have tested and what the results were?
Sure. So item 19 is a hatchet from trunk of 2007 Chevrolet Impala. I did not develop any latent prints on this item. Item 19-1, blade cover from item 19. I did not develop any latent prints on this item. Item 47, machete from on top of microwave at 743 Schmidt Road. I did not develop latent prints on this item. Item 48, machete. I did not develop latent prints on this item. Item 48-1, sheath with item 48. I did not develop latent prints on this item. Item 49, broom from kitchen at 2744 East 53rd Street, number 8. I did develop one latent impression on this item. Item 52, bottle with cap and liquid contents from 2744 East 53rd Street. I did not develop latent prints on this item.
So item 48, what you have listed here as a machete, or the FBI evidence item 1B58, though it might not be very clear, did that appear to be this blue and black machete, if you recall?
I don't recall.
And then item number 52, bottle cap with liquid contents from 2744 East 53rd Street. Do you recall if that would have been a container of bleach?
I do not recall.
Okay. In any event, the only item in which you were able to develop a usable latent fingerprint was the item 49, the broom, located at 2744 East 53rd Street.
Correct.
Now, all of the items that were listed here, would you consider these items to be the porous items, the type that absorb fingerprints, or non-porous, the type where the prints are more easily damaged?
These are non-porous items in which the print is on top of the item.
And when you've said that or testified here that you were not able to identify any usable prints, does that mean, or from your recollection, that you didn't see any prints at all for these items, or were there things that you found, they just were not usable?
I think what I do recall is that I didn't see any friction ridge development on any of the items except for the broom, in which I did develop an actual latent impression on that item.
So with the exception of item 49, you did not observe any friction ridge detail on any of the other items that were provided to you?
Correct, just item 49.
Were you provided a known latent print for comparison in this case?
Do you mean a known fingerprint card for an individual?
Yes.
I was provided with a person of interest with a FBI number identifier, which allows me to then pull any known records if needed for comparison.
And in this particular case, was the individual you would have compared a known record to identified as Henry Dinkins?
Yes.
So turning then to page 2 of your report, specifically then for item number 49, were you able to compare that your usable latent fingerprint to the known record for Henry Dinkins?
Yes.
And what were the results of that comparison?
Mr. Dinkins was excluded from the latent impression that was detected on item 49.
So again, and going back to those other items that you had attempted to locate any sort of usable friction ridge detail, again, were those the types of items that, because of their non-porous nature, it just may be more difficult for you to locate those any usable prints?
Yes, because the latent prints that are on non-porous items, they tend to be more fragile just because they are setting on top of the surface. So it is easy to damage those latent prints.
And if somebody had wiped those items down or cleaned those items, that would have also affected your ability to find any prints on those items?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions.
Mr. Freeze?
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
So, Ms. Brillhart, you were brought here from the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, right?
Yes.
And just so I can summarize, you were able to get one print off this kitchen broom, correct?
Yes.
And that print excluded Mr. Dinkins, right?
Yes.
So to summarize your testimony here today, you were brought here from the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia to tell us that the one print you were able to examine excluded Mr. Dinkins, right?
I think so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, you were able to examine one print and compare it, right?
Yes.
And that one print excluded Mr. Dinkins, correct?
Yes.
And you were asked to try to find latent prints on a hatchet, correct?
Yes.
And the blade cover from that hatchet, correct?
Yes.
And 2 machetes, correct?
Yes.
And a sheath from one of the machetes, correct?
Yes.
And there were no prints on those.
That is correct.
So you came here from Quantico, Virginia to tell us there was no prints on any of this stuff for Henry Dinkins.
Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Ms. O'Donnell.
Nothing based on that, Your Honor.
What's
Ms.
that?
O'Donnell.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. She came all the way from Virginia, y'all, just to say she didn't find no handprints of his. Wait a minute. Did anybody do any work? Did anybody do any work here for this girl? It seemed like they didn't do no kind of investigation. What's going on? Y'all tell me what y'all think. Like, share, and subscribe. I'm out.